Well, hello everybody, and thank you for watching this presentation. My name is Andres Filbaum. I'm from the University of Sydney, and I'm going to present a theoretical analysis on free public transport and how this policy might or should affect the design of stop spacing and optimal frequencies. So before starting the presentation itself, let me recognize and pay my respects to the elders and communities, past, present, and emerging, of the land where the campus of the university, or the main campus of the University of Sydney is located, the unceded lands of the Eora people of the Gadigal Nation. So why analyzing public transport? Well, in the 70s, so 50 years ago, there was actually quite some discussion in the world of transport engineering, academia, and practitioners about fare free public transport 50 years ago. In general, the conclusion was, let's not do this. However, in the last few years, there has been a revival of the debate. Equity arguments in terms of favoring the less affluent commuters, and also environmental arguments in terms of now it's more urgent than 50 years ago to reduce car use and therefore to attract people to public transport. And yeah, this has been happening in many countries in the world, and Australia is actually one of them. This is one header 9 months ago in the Sydney Morning Herald, where people discussing the possibility of free public transport, particularly in the CBD. COVID was one relevant factor stimulating free public transport. Many cities, mostly in the US and also in China, also in other places, but mostly in those two countries, implemented free public transport in order to prevent losing too many public transport users. So, okay, why? Why would we like public transport to be free? Well, the most obvious benefits are for less affluent commuters. For them, if they commute by public transport, this can be a relevant financial burden. Efficiency can increase. There are some studies showing that there are some no marginal effects in zero. Basically, you don't need to pay to inspectors that check whether people are paying or not. You don't need to create all these ticketing systems. There are many things that you can avoid, tap-ons and tap-offs that can also increase bus speed, etc., and attract drivers, right? If public transport is free, you might expect to attract drivers. Why would we not want free public transport? Most importantly, because it is very expensive. Most cities in the world, as you know, have relevant subsidies for public transport, but the revenue that comes from fares is still a very, very relevant component. So if it is 100% subsidized, that can be very, very important in terms of taxpayers. And maybe we not only attract drivers, maybe we also attract walkers. So in this presentation, I'm not going to say yes or no. I just want to focus on this last thing: attract drivers, attract walkers. It is crucial to determine whether public transport will attract, whether free public transport will attract mostly walkers or mostly drivers, especially if one of the reasons is sustainability. So there is a bit of evidence, not a lot because there are not so many places where we have free public transport. The flagship case is typically Tallinn. Tallinn is the capital of Estonia, about 500,000 of inhabitants, and they implemented free public transport for people living in Tallinn about 10 years ago. So there is already quite some evidence accumulated there. And actually, the evidence shows that almost half of the walkers switched to public transport and only 10% of car drivers. Please note that these are relative numbers. If we used absolute numbers, then they are very similar, walkers and drivers. But still, I mean, these numbers don't seem as good news. However, basically, this is the same system, but without fares. So what does the theory say? How should the system respond? So there is not a clear response for free public transport. That's basically what I'm presenting now. But there is a lot of research about how to design public transport. And typically, the theoretical models focus on a single line because that's easier, studying optimal frequencies and optimal spacing. So the most important or the most famous paper is from this, a series of papers from the 70s by Moring. Basically, the main argument is that if we have more users, we will need more frequency. And if we have free public transport, we need more users, right? And this diminishes waiting time for all. So this is the very well-known Moring effect, one of the reasons why it is a good idea to subsidize public transport, because more users will increase the quality of service. Johnson, in the 80s, refined Moring's model, and by including other aspects, crucially one of them was the time spent at bus stops, he concluded that this effect vanishes when the demand is very large. On the side of spacing, Tiracini in 2014 showed that in central areas, the optimal spacing is around 400 meters. In the peripheries, it might be greater, around 600 meters. So, which is the optimal spacing might depend. And this is coherent with the findings of Devonuri et al. In a paper from just 1 year ago, where basically they argue that short distance passengers prefer low spacing because walking time is very important for them, whereas long distance passengers prefer great spacing because great spacing will increase vehicles' speed, right? They will need to stop fewer times, and therefore, and long distance passengers care more about the speed. So, in all, frequency and spacing should be adapted to the demand, and the demand in turn changes when the fare drops. So that's why there is a need for analyzing how should the public transport design when fares drop. You will see that in my presentation, I will talk about optimal frequencies and optimal spacing. I already did. Typically, optimal, when we say optimal, we are minimizing the sum of users plus operators costs. Users are basically waiting plus in vehicle plus walking time. Operators cost depend on the number of vehicles, and every vehicle has a fixed component and a component that depends on the size of the vehicle. So what's our setting? We are going to consider a circuit of length L. So again, this idea of a single line, but besides the public transport line, we also have walking and cars. The origins and the destinations are evenly distributed, so everything is from the demand is quite simple. And with simple formulations that I'm not going to explain in detail, we can have linear costs, depending on the distance of the commuter. So here, DI is the distance traveled by the commuter I, and all walking, car, and public transport are linear. Crucially, walking does not have a fixed component, so short distance commuters will prefer to walk. What happens after that? So we have short distance walk, then we will have mid distance and long distance. And depending on the slopes is which mode is going to be preferred everywhere. So our assumption will be that long distance commuters drive and intermediate distance use public transport. This assumption makes sense if you think about the motivation of the paper. So you can think, I don't know, high-speed trains do not meet this assumption, right? But if one of our concerns is that free public transport might attract walkers, well, then it makes sense that public transport is in the middle, right? So we have walkers, short distance, cars, long distance, and public transport in the middle that might attract from one side or from the other. So how is mode choice affected by frequency and spacing? So spacing increases walking time, right? If we increase spacing, we increase walking time, which is the same from everyone, but it also increases speed, which is more important for long distance. So the overall effect is not so obvious. Frequency, on the other hand, will reduce waiting time for everybody and will increase speed for everybody. This is because it reduces the time at bus stops. So if we increase frequency, basically, public transport will become more appealing in general. And of course, lower price also makes public transport more appealing in general. So let me move my camera over here. So what happens when we run some numerical simulations? Well, as we said, larger spacing might do funny things. So this is the breaking point, the kilometers where we switch from public transport to cars, and here is from walking to public transport. So if spacing is too low, basically the speed is terrible. So increasing the spacing will be good in general, will increase the number of users using public transport. The same, if spacing is too long, nobody wants to walk that much. So reducing spacing increases for everybody. The thicker lines over here show realistic values for spacing, and crucially in this sector, so basically up to 400 or 500 meters, you can see that both curves are increasing, meaning that if we increase spacing, we will lose some walkers because they don't want to walk so much to the bus stop, and they prefer to walk in general, but we will attract some public transport drivers because we are increasing the speed. So this is very, very relevant in terms of inducing a modal choice that's more sustainable. Frequency, on the other hand, always attracts. So the greater the frequency, the greater the distance between the two curves, which is exactly the public transport share. So that's how the mode choice reacts. But how should the frequency and spacing respond to a drop in fare? There are actually two alternatives, depending on what's our goal. So the first one is optimally, and the second one is attract only car drivers. So when we say optimally, basically we mean we want to minimize public transport costs, forgetting about the mode choice. So if we want to minimize the total cost of the public transport subsystem, we have a theorem that says that if the average distance does not change, then the frequency has to increase and the spacing has to decrease. The main reason for this is because we have more users, and therefore users are more relevant compared to the operators. So this is when the average distance does not change, but that's not necessarily true, right? Because we are attracting users from both sides, cars and walker. So what happens in total? Well, if the number of users increases, this is exactly what we said here. If the average distance increases, both spacing and frequency should increase. Spacing because now the speed is more important, and frequency because we have more passengers kilometers. And in total, what we find is that this is what happens. So the average distance increases, and therefore frequency has to increase when the price drops. So moving to the left here, but spacing might do some funny things. What happens if we want to attract car drivers? Well, when the price drops, not necessarily being free, any drop in the price, we can increase spacing so that no walkers are attracted. And please note that we will attract car drivers because the changes in the fare and the changes in the spacing benefit car drivers, benefit long-distance commuters. And the theorem 2 is basically that we can do the same, increasing the spacing, not so much, and also reducing the frequency. And here the remark is that extra spacing and lower frequency makes the system cheaper to operate because we require fewer buses and the buses will be faster. This is not enough to compensate for the revenue losses, but still. So these are the changes in cost and frequency, and you can see this is the base case, and this is with zero fare. You can see that the difference is quite significant, mostly because we are reducing the frequency to about half. And the changes in public transport ridership are very, very important. So the break point from public transport to cars was originally in 5 kilometers, and then it is from 7 to 9 kilometers, more or less, depending on the space. So what are the most important conclusions and policy implications? Well, our papers has many simplifying assumptions: demand model, uniform distribution of origins to destinations. We can adjust spacing. So this means that the exact results, our exact numerical simulations are, of course, not realistic, right? However, the qualitative conclusions they are sound. And we can argue in a very intuitive way about this. So greater spacing will attract long-distance travelers and deter short-distance travelers. And therefore, the mode shift will be more sustainable compared to the case in which we don't change bus spacing at all. Of course, this doesn't imply that we can attract more car drivers than walkers, right? That requires a more sophisticated mode choice model. But we can induce a more sustainable mode shift. That's the main message of this presentation. We are assuming that spacing can be adjustable. That's quite simple for buses. For rail-based systems, it's of course a relevant limitation. It is still important for long-term planning because at some point you need to decide where to put the stations, but it could also have implications in terms, for instance, of express services, right? And we assume that long-distance travelers are cars. As I said at the beginning, that might be strong assumptions, but for instance, in Sydney, that's the case. So here you can clearly see that the outer suburbs are much more pink, and that means that the percentage of car drivers is greater. Policy implications: if free public transport is going to be implemented, then the design should change. How it should change, it depends on the goal. If the objective is to minimize total public transport costs, then increase frequency and reduce spacing. If the objective is to induce a sustainable mode slip, do the opposite. General conclusion: not only in terms of free public transport, stop spacing can be a useful tool in terms of mode choice. Future research: long-term decisions of commuters. Can free public transport, for instance, discourage purchasing a car? That would be very important, but it is unclear. And network implications, because this was all done in a corridor. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer your questions in the Q&A session on the February 20th.